We're going to take a look back at how the presidents became president. This is your countdown to 47. First on our list is the father of our country, George Washington. Prior to becoming the first president, Washington was a surveyor of the Shenandoah lands in the Western Virginia Territory. His knowledge of the land became quite useful upon the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, in which Washington served as a lieutenant colonel on the side of the British. In 1775, the Continental Congress commissioned George Washington as commander-in-chief of their newly formed army. General Washington led the army to crucial victories throughout the Revolutionary War, including when he famously crossed the Delaware in Christmas of '76. The war was won with the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781. The Treaty of Paris in '83 brought a diplomatic end to the war, with Great Britain now officially recognizing America's independence. Months after the signing of the treaty, once the last of the British troops evacuated, Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington retired to Mount Vernon until he realized that the nation under the Articles of Confederation was not the United States that we have today. He then became a leading figure in the push for a constitutional convention in 1787. Once the new Constitution was ratified, the time came for the nation to select its first chief executive. The Electoral College convened to cast their ballots for the presidency. Washington was unanimously elected. On April 30th, 1789, General Washington was inaugurated in New York City and became the nation's first president. Washington served as President of the United States for 2 terms, from 1789 to 1797. This began a precedent honored by every president for more than 150 years. We turn now to the Atlas of Independence, John Adams. Prior to becoming the second president, Adams was a Harvard-educated lawyer. Despite his avid patriotism, in 1770, Adams famously served as the defense counsel for the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre, due to his belief that all people maintain the right to a free and fair trial. In the summers of 1775 and 76, Adams served as a delegate for the Massachusetts colony in the Second Continental Congress, where he was a driving force in the movement for independence. That's something of an understatement, actually. In fact, he's the one who led the campaign to unite the colonies to adopt the Declaration of Independence. So it's Adams we have to thank for uniting the states into one nation. During the Revolutionary War, Adams traveled to France and later to Holland to arrange support for the American cause. When the war was over, he was a key negotiator of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where Great Britain officially recognized America's independence. Adams then went on to serve as the first U.S. minister to Britain. After 10 years abroad as a diplomat, he returned to the United States and was elected in 1789 as the first vice president of the United States under George Washington. When Washington chose not to run for a 3rd term in 1796, Adams, always the one to seize an opportunity, ran for the high office. He, of course, won and became the nation's 2nd president. While in office, Adams' most notable accomplishment was keeping the United States out of an ongoing war between France and Britain, despite heavy pressure to get involved, even from his vice president. Adams ran for re-election in 1800, but he ultimately lost to Thomas Jefferson. This marked the first peaceful transfer of power from the losing incumbent to his successor. John Adams served as President of the United States from 1797 to 1801. Next is the father of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Prior to becoming the 3rd president, Jefferson served as a delegate for the Virginia colony to the Second Continental Congress. It was there, in 1776, when he was 33 years old, that he drafted the Declaration, and following much debate, Congress adopted the Declaration on July 4th, 1776, and the United States of America was born. During the Revolutionary War, Jefferson served in many roles, including as governor of Virginia, as well as a delegate to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Once the war was over, Jefferson served as minister to France before he became the first ever Secretary of State in George Washington's presidential cabinet. It was in this role where he famously clashed with Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, which ultimately led to Jefferson's resignation from the role in 1793. When Washington chose not to run for a 3rd term as president in 1796, Jefferson ran for the position. He ultimately lost to John Adams, and due to how the Constitution was written at the time, prior to the 12th Amendment, Jefferson, as the runner-up, became the nation's second vice president. Jefferson and President Adams disagreed on much of the administration's policies, including Adams' refusal to involve America in an ongoing war between Britain and France, with whom Jefferson had sympathies. Following Adams' signing of the much-maligned Alien and Sedition Acts, it now seemed possible Adams could be defeated running for re-election. So, in 1800, Jefferson ran against Adams again, but he wasn't the only one. This time around, fellow Democratic Republican Aaron Burr put up quite the challenge vying for the presidency as well. The young republic saw its first ever electoral tie. While Adams was defeated, Jefferson and Burr had both received 73 electoral votes. It came down to the House of Representatives to settle the tie. And in a piece of historical irony, Alexander Hamilton and his influence over the Federalists decided the election in Jefferson's favor, a decision which contributed to Vice President Aaron Burr eventually challenging Hamilton to that now infamous duel. Jefferson was sworn in on March 4, 1801, and became the nation's third president. Some of Jefferson's notable accomplishments while in office include the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, as well as keeping the United States out of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Thomas Jefferson served as President of the United States from 1801 to 1809. We're now going to look at the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Prior to becoming the fourth president, Madison first became politically active once the Revolutionary War broke out. But it wasn't until after the war ended when Madison found his moment to shine, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Madison had long wrote of the issues with the Articles of Confederation and seized the opportunity to engage in debate to become a leading voice in the push for a strong central government. Madison's pen aided in crucial ratifications to the Constitution, published as the Federalist Papers, and he helped frame the Bill of Rights. Upon Jefferson becoming president, Madison was named as Secretary of State. While he held that post, Madison strongly protested against both France and Britain's continuous seizure of American ships. In 1808, James Madison sought the high office for himself. He ran as a Democratic Republican and beat out Federalist candidate Charles C. Pinckney of South Carolina for the presidency. James Madison served as President of the United States from 1809 to 1817. During his tenure, he led the young nation through the largest conflict it had seen since the Revolution, the War of 1812. After years of British impressment of American sailors, Madison had had enough and asked Congress to go to war. In the war, part of Washington, D.C. burned, including the White House. It was during this harrowing event that Madison's First Lady Dolly famously saved a portrait of George Washington. By the end of the war, a status quo was restored, but the war forever defined Madison's presidential legacy. America needed time to recover, and thankfully a new era was on the horizon, an era of good feelings. Turning now to the president who ushered in the era of good feelings, James Monroe. Prior to becoming the fifth president, Monroe enlisted in the 3rd Virginia Infantry upon the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and fought under the command of General George Washington. Monroe was there when Washington crossed the Delaware in Christmas of '76, and he's depicted in this painting as the man holding the American flag behind Washington. He was later wounded during the Battle of Trenton, but reached the rank of lieutenant colonel before the war was over. Post-war, Monroe served as a member of the Congress of the Confederation, a U.S. Senator, and Virginia's governor. Monroe also had a hand in negotiating the Louisiana Purchase. In 1811, Monroe was appointed Secretary of State by President James Madison. Monroe, along with President Madison, pushed Congress to declare war on Britain, thus beginning the War of 1812. During the war, Monroe took on the additional responsibility as the acting Secretary of War. It was in this role where Monroe expanded U.S. claim to western Florida. Madison, following Washington's footsteps, decided to only serve 2 terms. Monroe became the obvious choice for the Democratic Republicans, and he easily won the election of 1816 against his Federalist opponent, Rufus King. The era of good feelings had begun. Monroe's presidency expedites the growth of the states, securing the Florida Territory from Spain. Monroe's most famous accomplishment, though, while in office, came in 1823, where alongside Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, which served as a warning against further European colonialism or interference in the Western Hemisphere. The doctrine, as well as the years of peace, remain Monroe's lasting legacy. James Monroe served as President of the United States from 1817 to 1825. Historians regard Monroe as the last of the Founding Father presidents. The time had come to hand the care of the nation over to a new generation. Let's look now at the first president who was the son of a president, John Quincy Adams. Prior to becoming the sixth president, at the age of 7, Adams witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill nearby his family farm. While he was still just a child, he accompanied his father, John Adams, to Europe during the American Revolution to aid in negotiations, where he studied at various academies and universities and became quite the linguist. In 1794, when he was still just 26 years old, President George Washington appointed him as the U.S. Minister to the Netherlands, and years later, he was appointed by his father, President John Adams, to the role of U.S. Minister to Prussia, which is now Germany. His promising career continued to rise. He served as a U.S. Senator for the state of Massachusetts and later as Minister to Russia. He also helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent to bring an end to the War of 1812, and he became Minister to Britain, where he was instrumental in the improvement of post-war relations. Under President Monroe, John Quincy was named Secretary of State and is remembered as one of the best to ever hold that post. One of his biggest accomplishments in the role included when he, alongside President Monroe, issued the Monroe Doctrine. In 1824, John Quincy Adams made his bid for the presidency. General Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote and the most electoral votes of any candidate, but no candidate won a clear electoral majority. This sent the fate of the election over to the House of Representatives. Speaker of the House Henry Clay threw his support behind Adams, which swayed the election in his favor. The son of the president had become president. Adams' moment of triumph was met with controversy. Andrew Jackson and his supporters claimed a corrupt bargain was struck between Adams and Clay, a claim they both denied. Nevertheless, Jackson's supporters in Congress opposed Adams at every opportunity throughout his term, leading to very few of his ideas seeing fruition. Adams and Jackson faced off again in the election of 1828. Jackson, of the newly founded Democratic Party, won this time around. Adams, like his father before him, would only have one term in the high office. John Quincy Adams served as President of the United States from 1825 to 1829. His successor would usher in an era all his own. We now arrive at Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Prior to becoming the seventh president, Jackson gained national notoriety during the War of 1812, where he served as a general in the Army. He led his troops to victory at key battles throughout the war, including at Pensacola in 1814, and most famously, defeating the British at New Orleans in January of 1815. This made Jackson a national hero shortly before the official end of the war. In 1818, Jackson invaded Spanish Florida. His actions there and in the Seminole Wars had a hand in causing the Spanish to renounce all claims in Florida to the United States a year later. After serving as governor of the Florida Territory and later as a U.S. Senator, General Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency. In 1824, Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes of any candidate. But since no candidate won a clear electoral majority, the fate of the election was now in the hands of the House of Representatives. Speaker of the House Henry Clay threw his support behind then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, which led the election to be certified in Adams' favor. Upon Clay being named as Adams' Secretary of State, Jackson and his supporters claimed there was a corrupt bargain that was struck between the two, a claim they both denied. The fallout of the election would lead to the beginning of the Jacksonian era of American politics. In 1825, a coalition of Jackson supporters broke away from the Democratic Republicans and formed their own party, known as the Democrats. In 1828, with the backing of his new party, Andrew Jackson ran for the presidency once more. Jackson handily beat Adams in the election and went on to become the nation's 7th president. Jackson's victory this time around came as he appealed directly to the voters, first in campaign history. He sold himself as a representative of the common man, and when he was to be inaugurated, crowds gathered to see him. He was seen as the people's president. As president, Jackson fought against the National Bank and used his power of veto to overrule Congress more times than any president up to that point. He also signed into law the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the Trail of Tears, where an estimated 4,000 Cherokee Indians died. This remains one of the biggest stains on Jackson's presidential legacy. Jackson's actions drew strong opposition and led to the forming of a new party, the Whigs. These were the early stages of the two-party system that we know today. Andrew Jackson served as President of the United States from 1829 to 1837. As Jackson's time in the high office came to an end, his Vice President, Martin Van Buren, was elected to be his successor, ensuring that the legacy of Jackson would loom large for years to come. Next up is the little magician, Martin Van Buren. Prior to becoming the 8th president, Van Buren was a lawyer in New York who was elected to the state Senate and became the state's Attorney General. In 1821, Van Buren became a U.S. Senator and was briefly the governor of New York in 29. He resigned that role upon being named Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State. During Jackson's first term, Van Buren established himself as a loyal figure to the president. So much so, in fact, that when a rift formed in Jackson's cabinet, he resigned his post in an effort to force other members to do the same, so that Jackson could appoint a new cabinet. Jackson, recognizing Van Buren's fastidious nature, sought to appoint him as U.S. Minister to Britain. However, when Van Buren was to be confirmed for the role, then Vice President Calhoun voted against the appointment. In response, when Jackson ran for re-election in 1832, he tapped Van Buren as his running mate. The two founders of the Democratic Party were now on the same ticket. For 4 years, Van Buren served as Jackson's vice president and was seen as his natural successor. In 1836, the little magician ran for the high office himself and won, defeating William Henry Harrison of the Whig Party. In his tenure, President Van Buren would oversee the greatest economic crisis the country had seen up to that point, the Panic of 1837. This was caused by a number of factors. Firstly, Jackson's war on the Second Bank of America had inadvertently created instability in the U.S. dollar. Secondly, in an attempt to fix it, President Jackson issued an executive order that the sale of all public land be purchased with gold or silver. By the time Van Buren took office, the damage had been done. Banks and businesses failed, thousands of people had lost their land. America was in a depression. President Van Buren's various attempted solutions only seemed to make things worse. This crisis and his refusal to annex Texas remained the legacy of President Martin Van Buren. Van Buren's attempt for re-election in 1840 was doomed from the start. He was defeated by William Henry Harrison of the Whigs, who would be sure to leave his own mark on the presidency, just not the one he had intended. Now to old Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison. Prior to becoming the 9th president, Harrison joined the Army and was stationed in the Northwest Territories in 1791. During his time in the service, Harrison played a key part in battles that expanded the American frontier, including the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which allowed for the settlement of the Ohio region. Years later, Harrison became the governor of the Indiana Territory. One of Harrison's responsibilities in this role was to defend American settlements. In 1809, the threat against settlers grew to a point where Harrison sought to address it. This eventually led to the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison's leadership during that battle is what propelled him to gain national recognition, and it earned him the nickname. In the War of 1812, Harrison, now holding the rank of brigadier general, led the army to victories including the retaking of Detroit and defeating the British and their allies in the Battle of the Thames. Tippecanoe had established himself as a national hero. In 1836, when the Whigs needed a candidate to go against Andrew Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, Harrison was one of the ones they chose. He ultimately lost to Van Buren, but after the Panic of 1837, Harrison and the Whigs saw their opportunity. In 1840, Harrison led one of the most famous campaigns in American history, with their catchy slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, as well as their down-to-earth frontier image. The Harrison campaign easily won over the Depression-ridden American voters. Harrison defeated incumbent Martin Van Buren in an electoral landslide to become the nation's 9th president. President Harrison was inaugurated on a cold and wet March day in 1841, where he gave the longest inaugural address, lasting an hour and 40 minutes. He caught pneumonia and died exactly 1 month later, a first in presidential history. William Henry Harrison served as President of the United States from March 4, 1841 to April 4, 1841, the shortest term of any chief executive. The highest office in the land was in uncharted territory. Tippecanoe was president, and now Tyler was too. We've now reached His Excellency, John Tyler. Prior to becoming the 10th president, Tyler had an active early political career. He served in the House of Representatives, was elected the governor of Virginia, and was later elected to the U.S. Senate. Despite his disdain for President Andrew Jackson, Tyler became an ally to the president in his opposition to the National Bank. Tyler eventually resigned from the Senate and joined the Whig Party in their opposition to Jackson and his supporters. In the election of 1836, Tyler was a vice presidential candidate, but ultimately lost to Martin Van Buren's presidential ticket. After the Panic of 1837, the Whig Party saw their best chance for the high office. William Henry Harrison received the nomination, and Tyler was chosen as the vice presidential nominee to balance their party's ticket. After the whirlwind campaign of 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler won in an electoral landslide. Tyler was sworn in as vice president in March of 1841. He returned to his home in Virginia, not expecting to return to Washington until the Senate convened that June, but something unexpected happened. President Harrison had developed pneumonia and died only 1 month into his term. A constitutional crisis ensued. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution at the time specified only that upon the president's death, resignation, or his inability to serve, the vice president would act as president. It was unclear what would happen next. Tyler objected to the notion of being the acting president. He claimed the full powers of the office now belonged to him. This set the precedent that the vice president would fully become the president and serve out the remainder of the existing term. While we take this notion for granted now, it wasn't until Tyler that this became clear. Once Tyler established his presidential authority, he quickly made enemies in his own party. He battled the Whigs in Congress on the issue of the National Bank. He was subsequently expelled from his party. Tyler was also the first president who had articles of impeachment introduced against him, although that resolution failed. President Tyler's biggest policy push would be for the annexation of Texas, but he was repeatedly foiled by Congress. Once he was convinced of James K. Polk's support for the annexation of Texas, John Tyler would drop out of the presidential race, the first incumbent president to not seek re-election. John Tyler served as President of the United States from 1841 to 1845. Now to young Hickory, James K. Polk. Prior to becoming the 11th president, Polk began his career in politics in the Tennessee legislature. In 1825, Polk entered the U.S. House of Representatives as a Democrat, where he became a vocal supporter of President Andrew Jackson. 10 years on, Polk was elected to become the Speaker of the House. He held that post until he left Congress in 1839, when he was elected to be Tennessee's governor. In 1844, Polk was the leading candidate for vice president on the Democratic ticket, with former President Martin Van Buren expected to win the nomination. However, Van Buren's public opposition to Texas's annexation provided Polk with an opportunity. Polk openly called for Texas's annexation, as well as the full occupation of Oregon, establishing himself as the expansionist candidate. An elderly Andrew Jackson pushed for the nomination of any candidate who would fulfill America's manifest destiny. This apparent endorsement, as well as Polk's open support for expansionism and his pledge to only serve one term, was enough to secure him the nomination for president. Polk, now dubbed as Young Hickory by the press, appealed to the South with his push for Texas's annexation, and to the North with the idea of acquiring Oregon. His opponents, the Whigs, would mock Young Hickory's apparent obscurity with the phrase, "Who is James K. Polk?" Well, they'd soon have their answer as he went on to defeat Henry Clay in the election and become the 11th President of the United States. The original dark horse president soon went to work. Just 3 days before Polk took the reins, Congress passed a resolution offering to annex Texas, which Polk promptly signed. This put the U.S. closer to war with Mexico. President Polk, in his push to acquire the Oregon Territory, would also risk war with Great Britain. He sought to claim the territory up to the latitude of 5440, which was the southern border of Russian Alaska. In an effort to stave off yet another war with Great Britain, Polk agreed to the Treaty of Oregon in 1846, where the United States would acquire nearly all the territory south of the 49th parallel, from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. As tensions cooled along the northern border, they were just starting to heat up in the south. Polk, seeking to gain California, offered Mexico $20 million. They declined. The president sought to put pressure on Mexico by sending General Zachary Taylor to the disputed territory along the Rio Grande. The Mexicans, taking this as a sign of aggression, attacked Taylor's troops. This began the Mexican-American War. The war would last 2 years and reshape America, literally. The land gained by the end of the war would include what is now the states of California, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, as well as parts of Colorado and Wyoming. At war's end, the question of whether the newly acquired land would allow for the expansion of slavery only added to the already growing tensions between free and slave states. This set into motion a cascading set of events that culminated in the Civil War. Polk, satisfied with his one term in office, chose not to seek re-election in 1848. Young Hickory left office in 1849 in poor health, retiring to Tennessee, where he died 3 months later, the shortest post-presidency of any to ever hold the office. James K. Polk served as President of the United States from 1845 to 1849. Looking now to old rough and ready Zachary Taylor. Prior to becoming the 12th president, Taylor joined the military at the age of 22 and went on to serve in the War of 1812. But it was after over 30 years of military service that Taylor gained national notoriety. In 1846, Taylor was sent by President Polk to the disputed border with Mexico along the Rio Grande. It was there where threatened Mexican soldiers attacked Taylor's troops, inciting the Mexican-American War. General Taylor led the army to crucial victories throughout the war, including at Monterey in 46 and Buena Vista in 47. Old Rough and Ready had established himself as an American hero, and he seemed the ideal candidate for the Whigs in the election of 1848. His 4-decade-long military career appealed to Northern voters, and his ownership of slaves appealed to the South. Taylor ran against Lewis Cass of the Democrats, but it was the third-party candidacy of former President Martin Van Buren that turned the tide of the election. Van Buren ran on the free soil ticket and was able to pull enough voters away from Cass that cinched the election for Taylor. President Taylor would gain a reputation of acting independently. He advocated for settlers in the New Mexico and California territories to apply for statehood. This angered Southerners who believed neither one would allow for the expansion of slavery. In 1850, when Southern leaders threatened to secede, he responded in kind. He told them he would lead the army himself if he had to in order to enforce the laws, and that anyone captured in rebellion would be hanged. Taylor's strong will kept the South in line for a time. On a sweltering July 4th later that year, President Taylor participated in ceremonies as he visited the construction of the Washington Monument. When he returned to the Executive Mansion, now called the White House, he consumed ice water and fresh fruit. He soon fell ill with stomach pain. It was not initially considered life-threatening, but after 5 days of worsening intestinal pain, Taylor died of what scholars suspect to have been cholera. 16 months into his term, President Taylor became the second chief executive to die in office, and with him died what could have been the last chance to prevent the Civil War. Zachary Taylor served as President of the United States from 1849 to 1850. It's time now for the last of the Whigs, Millard Fillmore. Prior to becoming the 13th president, Fillmore practiced law in New York and served 8 years in the House of Representatives. Fillmore made a failed bid for the state's governor's office in 1844 and later became the New York State Comptroller. It was while he held that role that he ran for vice president on the winning presidential ticket of General Zachary Taylor in 1848. As vice president, Fillmore presided over the Senate during the debates over the Compromise of 1850. Fillmore implied to President Taylor that he would vote in its favor in the event of a tie. But Fillmore's responsibilities would soon change. In July of 1850, President Zachary Taylor died. For the second time in our nation's history, the vice president ascended to the high office. Upon Fillmore's taking office, Taylor's presidential cabinet resigned. Fillmore quickly made known his allegiance to the Whig Party. President Fillmore would voice his support for the Compromise of 1850. Notable parts of this compromise included California being admitted as a free state and the Fugitive Slave Act, which put federal officers at the disposal of slaveholders seeking runaway slaves. President Fillmore would sign each piece of that compromise into law. This remains his legacy. The legislation had intended to settle the issue of slavery, but instead created a temporary and uneasy peace. President Fillmore's own party would not forgive him for all the concessions he made to the South. So when he attempted a re-election bid in 1852, he failed to secure his party's nomination, losing to hero of the Mexican-American War, General Winfield Scott. Scott himself lost the election to Democrat Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. Millard Fillmore served as President of the United States from 1850 to 1853. Next is Franklin Pierce. Prior to becoming the 14th president, Pierce served in the New Hampshire legislature as a representative and later was elected their speaker. In 1833, Pierce entered the U.S. House of Representatives, and in 1937, he became a U.S. Senator. Pierce later resigned from the Senate and returned to New Hampshire state politics. Upon the outbreak of the Mexican-American War, Pierce served as a brigadier general under the command of General Winfield Scott. During this time, Pierce would lead troops on notable campaigns such as the Siege of Veracruz in 1847. From there, he'd lead them to meet up with General Scott before the capture of Mexico City later that year. At the Democratic Convention of 1852, the party decided their platform in support of the Compromise of 1850 and maintaining the era of uneasy peace it had ushered in. However, they lacked an agreed-upon candidate for the party to rally around. Once all prominent candidates had been eliminated, Pierce was able to secure the nomination on the 49th ballot. Pierce would go on to face his former superior officer, General Winfield Scott of the Whig Party, in the general election, and he won. Pierce was set to become the 14th president. That feeling of victory would not last long. In January of 1853, President-elect Pierce, his wife, and his only surviving child were traveling on a train from Andover, Massachusetts to Concord, New Hampshire, when one of the flanges on a wheel broke, causing the train to derail. The accident resulted in many injuries, including to the president-elect, but it also led to one recorded death, Pierce's son, Benjamin. The nation, when Pierce entered the presidency, was in a time of uneasy peace. After the signing of the Compromise of 1850, tensions had cooled, but President Pierce would risk the peace as he pushed for growth. He tried to persuade Spain into selling Cuba, which angered Northerners, but his attempts there were ultimately unsuccessful. Pierce also would agree to the Gadsden Purchase, where the U.S. would pay Mexico $10 million to acquire what is now the southern parts of Arizona and New Mexico. But it was when Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that the delicate peace had been disrupted. The act repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and allowed for the people in the territories to decide for themselves whether they wanted to allow slavery. This led to Northerners and Southerners flooding into the territories in an effort to sway the vote. Tensions came to a head when the violence began. The bloodshed became known as Bleeding Kansas and put the U.S. closer to civil war than ever before. Pierce failed to secure renomination from the Democrats in 1856, who chose to nominate former Secretary of State James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, who went on to win the presidency. Franklin Pierce served as President of the United States from 1853 to 1857. We now look to Old Buck, James Buchanan. Prior to becoming the 15th president, Buchanan practiced law in Pennsylvania, and in 1814, Buchanan was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. Buchanan urged patriots to defend the nation after the burning of Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812. Buchanan himself would join a militia and serve in the Battle of Baltimore, fending off British advancement. In 1821, Buchanan became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served for 10 years. Buchanan was later appointed by President Andrew Jackson to serve as the U.S. Minister to Russia. Following his time in Russia, Buchanan was elected to the United States Senate, where he spent the next decade of his life. In 1844, Buchanan would run for president, but he lost the Democratic nomination to James K. Polk. In 1845, Buchanan was named as President Polk's Secretary of State, where he played a hand in negotiating the Treaty of Oregon in 1846. In 1852, Buchanan ran for the high office once again, but lost the nomination to Franklin Pierce. Pierce, upon becoming president, would appoint Buchanan as U.S. Minister to Britain, where Old Buck would push for the purchase of Cuba, but that ultimately failed. In 1856, Buchanan would run for president one more time. Due to his service abroad, as well as his absence during domestic controversies like Bleeding Kansas, Buchanan was able to secure the Democratic nomination for president. The general election would see three prominent candidates. Buchanan faced off with challenger John C. Fremont of the newly founded Republican Party, as well as former President Millard Fillmore running for the American Party and what remained of the Whig Party. Buchanan won the election. The office he had long sought was now his, but he'd soon find the job was not what he wanted it to be. Just 2 days after Buchanan took office, the United States Supreme Court handed down one of its most infamous rulings, the Dred Scott decision. The decision stated that enslaved people did not have any rights under the U.S. Constitution and that Congress had no right to ban slavery in federal territories. This decision pleased Southerners and incensed Northerners. Buchanan unwisely sought to remedy the tension by pushing for Kansas to become a slave state. This only angered Republicans and caused backlash from within his own party. Crisis after crisis embroiled Buchanan's time in office, such as the economic panic of 1857 and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, where 16 people were killed. Tensions were at an all-time high, and by the election of 1860, the Democratic Party split in two, each nominating their own candidate, none of whom were Buchanan. A four-way contest ensued, and Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln won the most electoral votes of any candidate, but had less than 40% of the total popular vote. In response, Southern states threatened secession while Buchanan pushed for compromise. With no compromise in sight, South Carolina seceded from the Union in December of 1860. The states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas would all secede before Buchanan left office, with more to follow to eventually become the Confederate States of America. James Buchanan served as President of the United States from 1857 to 1861. The Union was torn asunder, and it was now up to incoming President Abraham Lincoln to handle the worst crisis the nation has ever seen, the Civil War. We now arrive at the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln. Prior to becoming the 16th president, Lincoln grew up on the American frontier. His parents would foster in him a compassion and concern for others. The issue of slavery particularly bothered him. His childhood friends said he would engage in debates with other children about it. It was no surprise that Lincoln would later turn to politics. In 1834, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois legislature, where he served for 8 years. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a member of the Whig Party, where he served 1 term. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, allowing for the expansion of slavery. This drove Lincoln to pursue politics yet again. He ran for the U.S. Senate as a Republican in 1858, where he famously engaged in a series of debates with Democrat Stephen Douglas. While Lincoln lost the election, these debates would be published, propelling Lincoln to national recognition. In 1860, this recognition won him the Republican nomination for president. The election of 1860 saw 4 prominent candidates, including former debate rival Stephen Douglas. Lincoln won an electoral majority, but had less than 40% of the popular vote. Lincoln was set to become the 16th President of the United States. But the states were not united for long. After decades of building tensions between the North and South on the issue of slavery, South Carolina seceded from the Union following Lincoln's election. More states followed, eventually forming the Confederate States of America. This was the national crisis that greeted a newly inaugurated President Lincoln. Barely a month into his term, the Civil War began when Confederate soldiers attacked Fort Sumter. President Lincoln sought aggressive action against the Confederacy, but as the Union faced loss after loss, President Lincoln suffered a loss of his own. In February of '62, the president's son Willie died in the White House at the age of 11, leaving First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln inconsolable. As the president dealt with the loss of his son, he began to draft the document that would become his presidential legacy, the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all people being held as slaves in the Confederacy to be free. The war was no longer about simply quelling a rebellion. It was a war for freedom. In 1863, the Union would see victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which turned the tide of the war. At the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery later that year, Lincoln would deliver his famous Gettysburg Address, where he redefined the Civil War as the fight for the liberties that the nation was founded upon. As General Ulysses S. Grant won victory after victory for the Union, the great emancipator ran for re-election in 1864. This time around, Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson was chosen as Lincoln's running mate to form a national Union ticket. The 11 Confederate states did not participate in the election, which led to a landslide victory against former Union General George McClellan. In January of 1865, Congress passed a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery, which President Lincoln signed. It was ratified as the 13th Amendment later that year. 3 months after that, the Confederate Army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, officially bringing an end to the Civil War. 5 days after the end of the war, President Lincoln, his wife, along with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, attended the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. While the play progressed, actor John Wilkes Booth entered the president's box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. After a brief scuffle with Major Rathbone, Booth leapt from the balcony and fled into the night. President Lincoln was taken to a boarding house across the street, where he died 9 hours later, the first president to be assassinated. Abraham Lincoln served as President of the United States from 1861 to 1865. The care of the fragile nation was now in the hands of Andrew Johnson, who would prove to be very different from his predecessor. Next up is the Loyalist and the veto president, Andrew Johnson. Prior to becoming the 17th president, Johnson owned a tailor shop in Greenville, Tennessee. Johnson got involved in local politics, becoming the town's alderman and later its mayor. In 1835, Johnson was elected to the state's House of Representatives, and in 41, he was elected to the state's Senate. However, Johnson's career began to take off with his election to the United States House of Representatives, where he served for a decade until his election to the Tennessee governor's office in 1853. After a 4-year term as governor, Johnson was elected the state's U.S. Senator. It was while Johnson served this term that he was faced with a challenge. His home state of Tennessee became the final one to secede from the Union in June of 1861. Johnson stood with his country, remaining loyal to the United States during the Civil War. In 1862, Johnson resigned from the Senate upon his appointment as the military governor of Tennessee, holding the rank of brigadier general. In 1864, President Lincoln was running for re-election and seeking a national Union ticket. With that goal in mind, the Loyalists seemed the perfect running mate. On March 4, 1865, at the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson made a speech in the Senate chambers before being sworn in as the 16th Vice President of the United States. Just as soon as he began, it became clear to everyone there that Johnson was intoxicated. His meandering address caused great concern among the senators, so much so that 2 of them called on him to resign. But Vice President Johnson would not resign, and would soon occupy the high office for himself. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Vice President Johnson visited the wounded president shortly before his death the next morning. Following the death of Abraham Lincoln, Johnson was swiftly sworn in as the 17th President of the United States. President Johnson's time in office would become best known for his quarrels with Republicans in Congress. Throughout his term, Johnson issued amnesty proclamations to any former Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the United States. He eventually granted a full pardon to anyone who took that oath that was charged with treason in the Civil War. And as Congress passed bills regarding Reconstruction and the civil liberties of newly freed slaves, President Johnson issued veto after veto. The Loyalist would soon establish a new nickname for himself, the Veto President. The rift between the chief executive and Congress grew until 1867, when Johnson dismissed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, which allegedly violated the Tenure of Office Act. Articles of impeachment were soon introduced against him, and for the first time in the nation's history, the United States House of Representatives voted to impeach. In spring of 1868, Johnson faced trial in the Senate and was acquitted by only one vote. He attempted a bid for the Democratic nomination for president in 1868, but was unsuccessful. Andrew Johnson served as President of the United States from 1865 to 1869. We turn now to unconditional surrender Grant. Before Ulysses S. Grant became the 18th president, he was named Hiram Ulysses Grant. But when he entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, his name was incorrectly written as Ulysses Simpson Grant, which he chose to adopt as his name going forward. After graduating from West Point, Grant served in the Mexican-American War under Generals Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, where he participated in nearly every major battle of the war. Years later, at the onset of the Civil War, Grant took up arms to serve his country once again. He would distinguish himself in 1862 at the Battle of Fort Donelson, where he led his troops to victory. When a Confederate commander attempted negotiations, Grant stipulated that, quote, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." Upon Confederate agreement, he earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant went on to win crucial victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga in 1863. In response to his repeated victories, President Lincoln appointed him General-in-Chief of the Union Army. For the remainder of the war, Grant continued to press the Union advance. After continued Confederate defeats, including the fall of Richmond in April of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, officially ending the Civil War. Grant, now a national war hero, had made his mark on history. In 1868, Grant was the obvious choice for the Republican nomination, and he handily won the election that November. Ulysses S. Grant was set to become the 18th President of the United States. President Grant would sign into law 3 enforcement acts aimed to empower the President to use military force to protect the rights of African Americans. These laws specifically targeted the rising Ku Klux Klan, who were terrorizing black citizens. During Reconstruction, these acts helped to stave off violence against African Americans. The Grant presidency is also remembered for claims of corruption. While President Grant maintained that he was an honest man, those within his administration fell suspect, accused of accepting bribes. Notable scandals include the whiskey ring and the impeachment trial of Secretary of War William Belknap. However, Grant himself nor any in his administration were ever found guilty of corruption, and these claims would fail to deprive incumbent President Grant re-election in 1872. After winning re-election, President Grant also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which ensured that all citizens, regardless of race, have access to public accommodations. This was meant to be the legacy of President Ulysses S. Grant, but as his time in office came to a close, the controversial election of 1876 occurred, leading to the subsequent end to Reconstruction. And with its end, Grant's efforts towards civil liberties would not last. This would eventually lead to the rise of its antithesis, the Jim Crow era, which cast its long shadow over the American South for nearly a century. Ulysses S. Grant served as President of the United States from 1869 to 1877. Let's look now at Rudd, otherwise known as his fraudulency, Rutherford B. Hayes. Before becoming the 19th president, Hayes was a Harvard-educated lawyer practicing in Ohio. He took up cases defending runaway slaves and later fought against the spread of slavery into Western territories. His stances would lead him to join the burgeoning Republican Party. The Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in 1861 spurred Hayes to leave his life of comfort and enlist in the Union Army during the Civil War. In 1862, Hayes led troops on a charge in the Battle of South Mountain, where he suffered a musket wound. 2 years later, Hayes was wounded again at the Battle of Cedar Creek. In 1865, Republicans in his home city of Cincinnati entered him in a race for the U.S. House of Representatives. He accepted, but refused to campaign, saying he would not abandon his duty as an Army officer. Hayes won that election. In 1867, Hayes left Congress to run for the Ohio governor's office. He won that election too, and served until 1876. That same year, Hayes won the Republican nomination for president and went on to face Samuel J. Tilden of New York in the general election. The election of America's centennial year would be like no other. Despite hard campaigning from Republicans, Hayes fully expected Tilden to win. He reportedly went to bed on election night believing he had lost, but Republican leadership did not give up so easily. While Tilden won the popular vote, Republicans contested the electoral count in 4 states: South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, and Oregon. If all the contested states went to Hayes, it would certify the election in his favor. If even one went to Tilden, he'd win. Amid the uncertainty, Congress established an electoral commission in January of 1877 to determine the outcome. The commission, made up of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, decided the election along party lines. This certified Hayes as the victor, awarding him all the electoral votes necessary to win. The final count: 184 for Tilden, 185 for Hayes, the closest margin of victory in U.S. presidential history. Democrats were outraged. To appease them and prevent conflict, concessions were made. Most notably, federal troops were withdrawn from the states that made up the former Confederacy, bringing about the eventual end of the Reconstruction era. This eased the immediate tensions and became known as the Compromise of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes was set to become the 19th President of the United States. Some still embittered Democrats would begin to call the new chief executive his fraudulency. President Hayes sought to heal the divisions of the post-Civil War America. His policies included his pursuit of civil service reform and his push to get America onto the gold standard. In 1879, he signed a bill extending pensions for veterans. Hayes would also seek to protect the rights of African Americans in the South. But the end of Reconstruction led to failure on that front and ultimately a near century of Jim Crow. Hayes' actions as president were not able to overcome this as his lasting legacy. Rutherford B. Hayes served as President of the United States from 1877 to 1881. Turning now to the preacher president, James A. Garfield. Before becoming the 20th president, Garfield worked on a canal boat, earning enough money to attend seminary and eventually college. Garfield was later elected to the Ohio State Senate as an anti-slavery candidate. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Garfield advocated the coercion of seceding states to rejoin the Union. But when war was inevitable, Garfield joined the Union cause, where he served with distinction, eventually earning the rank of Major General. In 1862, Garfield was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, but did not resign his commission from the Army and take his seat until President Lincoln, in need of allies in Congress, urged him to do so in December of 1863. He went on to serve 9 terms there, during which time he maintained a focus on financial policy. In 1880, Garfield campaigned for president on behalf of his friend John Sherman. Sherman failed to obtain the Republican nomination, but after 36 ballots, Garfield himself was nominated. He and running mate Chester Alan Arthur defeated opponent Winfield Scott Hancock in the general election. Garfield was set to become the 20th President of the United States. President Garfield's main focus would be to take on the patronage system, drawing the ire of powerful members of Congress. Among them was Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York. Now let's discuss the patronage system a bit more, because it becomes so significant down the line of history. The system is where government officials, once becoming elected, reward the people who supported and helped them win with powerful positions. The struggle between President Garfield and Conkling would come to a head when Conkling contested one of Garfield's appointments. The 20th president would not back down and saw his appointments confirmed, but the preacher president had little time to savor his victory. On July 2, 1881, a disturbed man named Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield in the back at a railroad station in Washington, D.C. Guiteau was arrested while trying to flee. Garfield was taken to the White House, where doctors attempted to find and remove the bullet. They repeatedly probed the wound with unsterilized fingers and instruments, which caused infection. The president suffered for months as the infection grew worse, until he eventually succumbed to his wounds. Garfield became the second president to be assassinated. James A. Garfield served as President of the United States from March 4, 1881 until his death on September 19, 1881. The presidency now fell upon Chester Arthur, who would seek to rise above party politics. We've now reached the Dude President, Chester Alan Arthur. Prior to becoming the 21st president, Arthur was the son of an abolitionist Baptist preacher who instilled in him a motivation and value set he'd hold for the rest of his life. He graduated from college with high honors, was admitted to the state bar, and made partner at a Brooklyn law office all before the age of 25. In 1855, Arthur successfully prosecuted a case on behalf of a woman who sued a railroad company for forcibly removing her from a train car because of her race. In 1861, the Civil War began, and Chester Alan Arthur was appointed as Brigadier General in the New York Militia, and he was placed in charge of protecting the New York Harbor. The following year, he was promoted to Quartermaster General and was responsible for providing barracks, equipment, and food for soldiers. In 1871, President Grant appointed him Collector of the Port of New York, where he allied himself with New York Senator Roscoe Conkling, becoming a supporter of the patronage system. Now remember, we first introduced that concept when we looked at President Garfield last week. It's key to remember that both Grant and Arthur supported the patronage system. Garfield did not. This plays a huge role in Arthur's presidential genesis, but I won't get too ahead of myself. In 1880, Arthur and his ally Conkling lobbied for former President Grant to receive the Republican nomination. However, when dark horse candidate James A. Garfield was named the nominee, Arthur was chosen to be his running mate. The two were elected that November. When President Garfield and Senator Conkling began their struggle over Garfield's appointments, Vice President Arthur stood with his longtime ally. Garfield eventually won that struggle, but an assassin's bullet soon changed everything. On July 2, 1881, a disturbed man named Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield in the back at a railroad station in Washington, D.C. The assassin later claimed he shot Garfield to make way for Arthur to become president. He soon got his wish. After months of suffering, President Garfield succumbed to his wounds, dying just over 6 months into his term. Arthur was now to become the 21st President of the United States. However, President Arthur would prove to be a different kind of chief executive than many expected. Following Garfield's assassination, and after learning that he had a terminal case of kidney disease, Arthur had a change of heart. He distanced himself from old allies. The former supporter of patronage began to push for civil service reform. This passion culminated in his signing of the Pendleton Act of 1883, which protects government employees from being terminated on the basis of political affiliation. This law remains in effect today. Arthur also pushed for the lowering of tariffs to avoid continual government surpluses. This became a prominent partisan issue going forward. Nearing the end of his term, Arthur made a half-hearted attempt for the Republican nomination in 1884. This was because of his worsening kidney disease, which he kept a secret during his presidency. He died 1 year after leaving office at the age of 57. It was later said of Arthur that no man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted, and no one ever retired more generally respected. Chester Alan Arthur served as President of the United States from 1881 to 1885. Next is Uncle Jumbo, Grover Cleveland. Prior to becoming the 22nd president, Cleveland studied law in Buffalo, New York, before being admitted to the bar. When Cleveland was drafted to serve in the Union Army during the Civil War, he hired a substitute to serve on his behalf, which was something permissible back then. He began his career in politics with a failed bid for district attorney. Following his defeat, Cleveland returned to practicing law, and in 1871, he became a sheriff for 2 years. In 1881, his political career began to launch when he was elected mayor of Buffalo. The following year, he made a successful bid for the governorship of New York. As governor, Cleveland pushed for civil service bills challenging the patronage system and gained a reputation as a reformer. By 1884, Cleveland was a national figure and a natural choice for the Democratic nomination for president. The campaign of 1884 was bitter. Cleveland faced off with Republican opponent James G. Blaine. Days after receiving the nomination, Cleveland was accused of having fathered a son out of wedlock. He is said to have never confirmed or denied these claims, although Cleveland did financially support the boy while he lived in an orphanage before the child's eventual adoption. Despite this, the outcome was cinched just days before the election when Republican candidate James Blaine attended a dinner in New York City where a reverend claimed that Democrats were the party of, quote, rum, Romanism, and rebellion. This offended New York Catholics who responded by throwing their support behind Cleveland, which swayed the election. Grover Cleveland went on to become the 22nd President of the United States and the first Democrat to be elected to the high office since Buchanan in 1856, a good 28 years earlier. As president, Cleveland continued upgrading the Navy to steel battleships, which began under the Arthur administration. He also signed the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which put the railroad industry under federal jurisdiction, a first of its kind. He is also known for issuing the most vetoes of any president up to that point, with a whopping total of 414 in just the one term. In 1887, President Cleveland pushed for lowering tariffs. This became his signature issue, and it ultimately cost him re-election in 1888, losing to Republican Benjamin Harrison. Grover Cleveland served as President of the United States from 1885 to 1889. But a few years later, the two faced off again in the election of 1892 for the rematch of the century. Proceeding to the front porch campaigner, Benjamin Harrison. Prior to becoming the 23rd president, the grandson of the 9th president practiced law in Indianapolis. In 1856, Harrison joined the Republican Party. From there, Harrison was elected Indianapolis City Attorney, became Secretary of Indiana's Republican State Central Committee, and was elected reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court. In 1861, the Civil War began, and Harrison helped organize the 70th Regiment of the Indiana Infantry and received the rank of second lieutenant, but he quickly rose to the rank of colonel. Colonel Harrison rose to prominence during the Georgia campaign in 1864, including at the Battle of Resaca, where his unit pushed back the Confederates, leading to their eventual surrender. In 1865, President Lincoln nominated Colonel Harrison for the honorary rank of Brevet Brigadier General, which he received shortly before his honorable discharge. Following the war, Harrison made 2 unsuccessful attempts to win the governorship of Indiana. He became a U.S. Senator in 1881, where he served 1 term, championing the rights of American Indians, settlers, and Civil War veterans. Upon completion of his term, Harrison ran for president and won the 1888 Republican nomination. Harrison famously conducted most of his campaign from his front porch in Indianapolis, where he delivered speeches to those who would visit him. Incumbent President Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison went head-to-head that November. Cleveland's push to lower tariffs, as well as his stance against pensions for Civil War veterans, damaged his re-election bid. President Cleveland won the popular vote, but Harrison won a substantial electoral victory. Harrison, like his grandfather before him, would become the President of the United States. After his inauguration as the 23rd president, Harrison took a focus on foreign policy. The crowning achievement of his foreign policy was the Pan-American Congress in 1889, which strengthened American connections with Latin American nations. Harrison signed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, becoming the first regulation on the nation's monopolies. As chief executive, Harrison also signed the admission of 6 states into the Union, including North Dakota. But the issue of tariffs reared its head once again. Ohio Representative William McKinley proposed a bill that raised tariffs on average goods like sugar by nearly 50%. Harrison pushed against this, but acquiesced to the will of his party. After the signing of the controversial McKinley Tariff Act, Republicans lost popularity as well as many seats in Congress in 1890. President Harrison was renominated by the Republicans in 1892. In the general election, he faced his old rival, former President Grover Cleveland. Just days before the election, President Harrison's wife, Caroline, died of tuberculosis, which evaporated his will to win, and he was defeated by Grover Cleveland. Cleveland went on to become the first and currently only non-consecutive 2-term president. Benjamin Harrison served as President of the United States from 1889 to 1893. Returning now to Uncle Jumbo, Grover Cleveland, the 24th president. After leaving the White House in 1889 to President Benjamin Harrison, Cleveland moved to New York City and returned to his legal career. While in his post-presidency, Cleveland paid close attention to the actions of his successor. He saw a political opportunity once Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, which raised tariffs on average goods like sugar by nearly 50%. Cleveland openly opposed the tariffs, and in so doing, he regained a political following. This momentum carried him to the Democratic nomination for president in 1892. Cleveland came out the victor in a rematch election against incumbent President Harrison. The 22nd president was now set to also become the 24th. Cleveland's second term had barely begun before depression took hold of the nation. The Panic of 1893 saw businesses collapse, farmsteads foreclosed, and rampant unemployment. During this crisis, President Cleveland chose to prioritize the U.S. Treasury, working to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. The repeal allowed the Treasury to maintain its gold reserves. His perceived failure to act during the Panic of 1893 made him widely unpopular, ultimately costing him renomination by the Democrats in 1896. They chose William Jennings Bryan to face William McKinley of the Republicans in the general election to see who would become the last chief executive of the 19th century. Grover Cleveland served as President of the United States from 1893 to 1897. Now to the idol of Ohio, William McKinley. Prior to becoming the 25th president, McKinley taught at a school when the Civil War began. In 1861, an 18-year-old McKinley enlisted in the 23rd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, where he served under the command of future President Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes. McKinley received a promotion for his heroics during the Battle of Antietam, where he drove a wagon full of rations to his troops while under heavy fire. Hayes later described McKinley as one of the bravest and finest officers in the Army. In March of 1865, President Abraham Lincoln honored the 23-year-old McKinley by commissioning him the rank of brevet major. Following the war, McKinley returned to Ohio, where he became a leading figure in his community. In 1876, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Republican, where he served for 14 years. His main focus while holding this office was on tariff policy, and his endeavors ultimately culminated in the Tariff Act, which bears his name. McKinley left Congress for the Ohio governor's office in 1891, after winning the election over the incumbent. In 1892, McKinley was encouraged to vie for the Republican nomination for president, but he declined to do so, showing support for President Harrison. McKinley's popularity made him the obvious choice for the Republican nomination in 1896. He ran against populist Democrat William Jennings Bryan. McKinley beat Bryan with the widest margin of victory in 20 years. The idol of Ohio was set to become the 25th president of the United States. After President McKinley's inauguration in 1897, he quickly took action to end the depression caused by the Panic of 1893. He called a special session of Congress to pass the highest tariff in U.S. history. While McKinley had campaigned on the issue of financial policy, it was war that soon took his focus and came to define his time in office. The Spanish colony of Cuba was in revolt against its government. This put pressure on President McKinley to do something about it. He first sought peaceable terms, but mounting tensions expedited by the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor eventually led to the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The war proved to be the shortest in American history, lasting barely over 100 days, and resulted in the acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. McKinley, for the remainder of the term, ushered in economic prosperity. He ran for re-election in 1900 against William Jennings Bryan, where he and his new running mate Theodore Roosevelt won with a larger margin of victory than 4 years prior. The second term of President McKinley looked to bring a promising start to the 20th century. In September 1901, the 25th president visited the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York, where he gave an optimistic speech about the future of American prosperity and peace. Shortly thereafter, President McKinley was greeting citizens in a receiving line when anarchist Leon Czolgosz approached him with a cloth over his hand. Beneath the cloth, Czolgosz held a gun, which he used to fire off 2 shots at President McKinley. The first shot bounced off the president's coat button, but the second pierced his abdomen. McKinley died 8 days later, becoming the 3rd president to be assassinated. William McKinley served as President of the United States from 1897 until his death in 1901. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt then became the youngest president in the nation's history, where he left a legacy that would be etched in stone. Arriving now to the Lion, Theodore Roosevelt. Prior to becoming the 26th president, TR grew up in New York City, and at the age of 6, he watched the funeral procession of his hero, President Abraham Lincoln. In his youth, TR struggled with poor health, which drove him to develop a grit that would come to define his character. In 1895, TR was elected the president of the police commissioners in New York City, where he made police reform his mission, garnering national attention. In 1897, Roosevelt caught the eye of President William McKinley and was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In this role, TR vehemently pushed for war with Spain over the issue of Cuban independence. And when the USS Maine was destroyed in Havana Harbor in April of 1898, Roosevelt got his war. Within weeks of the Spanish-American War's beginning, TR resigned his post to join the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. The unit became known as the Rough Riders. TR and his Rough Riders served with distinction throughout the rather short war, most famously leading the charge at the Battle of San Juan Hill that July. By the time the war was over, Colonel Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were seen as national heroes. This popularity propelled Roosevelt to the governorship of New York before the year was out. After a successful 2 years as governor, Roosevelt gained a reputation as a reformer and was seen as a rising political star, much to the chagrin of some powerful members of his party, who saw an opportunity at the Republican National Convention of 1900. To remove Roosevelt as governor, New York Republicans successfully lobbied for his nomination as McKinley's vice president, and much to his reluctance, TR accepted. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won in a landslide. The Republican establishment in New York was pleased as TR resigned as governor in 1901 and entered the vice presidency, which at the time was considered a powerless position and a political graveyard. But everything changed when self-proclaimed anarchist Leon Czolgosz assassinated President McKinley in September of 1901. Theodore Roosevelt then became the 26th President of the United States and the youngest to ever hold the office at the age of 42. President Roosevelt soon made the role his own. He believed the president could take any action on behalf of the public that was not expressly forbidden by the U.S. Constitution. This interpretation of executive powers, which is still followed today, is why Roosevelt is considered the first modern president. While in office, Roosevelt took on the biggest issues of his day, most famously the monopolies that dominated American commerce, pushing for what he called a square deal for all Americans. His actions led to the breaking up of the megatrusts like Northern Securities Railroad and eventually Standard Oil. In foreign affairs, Roosevelt supported the revolutionary government in Panama, with whom he'd later form an agreement to construct the Panama Canal. In 1904, Roosevelt ran for a second term and won in his own right with over 70% of the Electoral College. After his victory, he boldly declared he would not seek a third term in 1908, a decision he'd later regret, but that's a story for another time. In 1905, TR exerted American strength in global affairs when he helped negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for this a year later. President Roosevelt used much of his second term to pursue conservationism. His years of commitment to the cause led to the preservation of 230 million acres of land. That's 1/10 of all land in the United States. Keeping to his pledge not to run in 1908, TR chose Secretary of War and personal friend William Howard Taft as his handpicked successor, believing that Taft would continue much of his policies. Taft was elected that November. Theodore Roosevelt served as President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. Next is Big Bill, William Howard Taft. Prior to becoming the 27th President, Taft aspired to be a Supreme Court Justice. His first step toward this goal was to become a lawyer, which he accomplished in 1880 with his admission to the Ohio State Bar. In 1887, Taft was named to the Superior Court of Ohio and was elected to a 5-year term the following year. During this time, his name was suggested for the U.S. Supreme Court, but his dream passed him by. Taft became the Solicitor General for President Benjamin Harrison in 1890. Within a year, he argued 18 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, winning 15 of them. At the age of 34, Taft was appointed to the Sixth Circuit of the United States Court of Appeals, where he served for the better part of 8 years. His first post of the new century was that of Chief Civil Administrator in the Philippines, appointed by President McKinley. After Theodore Roosevelt's ascension to the high office in 1901, Taft finally had another chance at his dream to become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. He declined twice. This was due to the influence of his wife, Helen Herron Taft, who had other aspirations for him. President Roosevelt then opted to name him as Secretary of War, which he accepted in 1904. Keeping to his pledge not to run for a third term in 1908, President Roosevelt named Taft as his successor. Taft reluctantly agreed in hopes of pleasing his friend. Roosevelt's endorsement was enough to carry Taft to the Republican nomination. In the general election, Taft faced off with a familiar opponent in William Jennings Bryan of the Democrats. Taft won the election and went on to become the 27th President of the United States. President Taft agreed with much of his predecessor's policies, but he did not endorse his means. Taft believed in limited executive powers, much to the opposite of former President Roosevelt. Taft, now the chief executive, was free to govern how he saw fit. President Taft faced backlash when he defended the Payne-Aldrich Act, which kept tariff rates high. Taft oversaw the ratification process of the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which authorized the federal government to institute a permanent income tax. In addition, Taft pushed for the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which allows for the direct election of U.S. senators by their constituents, rather than by state legislatures. Taft ran for re-election in 1912, but former President Theodore Roosevelt, displeased with his successor, challenged him for the Republican nomination. Taft won out, but Roosevelt and his supporters broke away from the Republicans to form the Progressive Party. President Taft placed third that November, winning only 8 electoral votes. Former President Roosevelt won 88, which remains the largest showing of any third-party candidate in U.S. history. However, the split between Taft and Roosevelt guaranteed the election of Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who won with an overwhelming 435 electoral votes. William Howard Taft served as President of the United States from 1909 to 1913. 9 years after leaving office, Taft finally achieved his dream and became the 10th Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, a post he held until shortly before his death in 1930. We've now reached the phrase maker, Woodrow Wilson. Prior to becoming the 28th president, Wilson was a professor of politics at Princeton University. In 1902, Wilson became president of the university, where he stayed for the next 8 years. Members of the Democratic Party talked Wilson into running for governor of New Jersey in 1910, an election he won. 2 years later, Governor Wilson was nominated for president by the Democrats. After decades of dominance, a rift in the Republican Party provided Wilson the perfect circumstances for victory. With both President Taft and former President Roosevelt on the ballot, the vote was split, thus handing Wilson the election. Woodrow Wilson was now set to become the 28th President of the United States. President Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Act of 1913, which lowered tariffs and introduced a graduated federal income tax. He also pushed for the passage of the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act, establishing each of the agencies that still exist today. In 1914, war erupted in Europe. Many of the major powers quickly became involved, beginning what we now know as World War I. President Wilson almost immediately declared America's neutrality. In the subsequent years, German submarines sank multiple American ships, killing many on board. Most notable of these was in 1915 with the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger ship traveling from New York City to England, resulting in the deaths of 128 Americans. Following this, the United States was drawn closer to the Allied side of the war. However, America officially remained neutral. President Wilson ran for re-election in 1916. Wilson's campaign touted the nation's neutrality and ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Wilson narrowly escaped defeat that November against Republican opponent Charles E. Hughes. On April 2nd, barely into his second term, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. They complied 2 days later, officially bringing the United States into the First World War. Soon after, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for military duty. At war's end, 2.8 million men were drafted, more than 116,000 of which were killed, and more than 200,000 were wounded. In January of 1918, President Wilson introduced his 14 points for world peace, which were meant to be used in negotiations at the end of the war. However, after an Allied victory, the Treaty of Versailles brought an official end to World War I, but Wilson's 14 points were mostly disregarded. The treaty mainly focused on punishing Germany with financial reparations, disarming their military, and the coerced concession of massive amounts of territory. This built resentment among Germans, setting the stage for the Second World War decades later. The Treaty of Versailles also called for the creation of the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations that we have today. Wilson began a public speaking tour to gain support. While on this tour, he suffered multiple paralytic strokes, nearly killing him. President Wilson kept his strokes a secret and spent the remaining 2 years of his term incapacitated, aided in part in his presidential duties by his wife. Woodrow Wilson served as President of the United States from 1913 to 1921. Now to wobbly Warren G. Harding. Prior to becoming the 29th president, at the age of 19, Harding bought an Ohio newspaper, becoming not only its owner, but its publisher. After 15 years of this, Harding's network of connections helped him begin his political career with his election to the Ohio State Senate, taking office in 1899. From there, he went on to hold the post of the state's lieutenant governor. In 1912, he gave the nominating address for President Taft at the Republican National Convention. 2 years later, Harding was elected to the United States Senate, where he spent the remainder of the decade. His time in that role was set to the backdrop of the First World War. And in 1920, when the Republican National Convention deadlocked on a candidate for president, his fellow senators successfully lobbied for Harding's nomination. Harding ran on a platform of, quote, a return to normalcy. While it was a rather vague platform, it was incredibly effective. Harding and his running mate Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts won the election with 63% of the popular vote, handily defeating the Democratic ticket of James M. Cox of Ohio and his running mate Franklin Delano Roosevelt of New York. Harding was now set to become the 29th President of the United States. President Harding sought to lead the nation out of the shadow of World War I. Harding, with aid from a Republican-controlled Congress, eliminated wartime controls and cut taxes in favor of establishing a federal budget system, as well as reinstating a high tariff. The country began to experience growth in economic prosperity, eventually leading to what we now know as the Roaring Twenties. President Harding, in his time, was quite popular. However, behind the scenes, the Harding administration was rife with corruption. Members of his cabinet had been using their official statuses to enrich themselves. The most famous of these scandals was Teapot Dome. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, had leased Navy petroleum reserves, including one named Teapot Dome in Wyoming, as well as two in California, to oil companies at low rates. Secretary Fall later resigned and was convicted of bribery, a first in U.S. history. How much President Harding knew about these scandals is unknown, although in the summer of 1923, while traveling to California with Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, he asked if he should go public with what he knew. Hoover told him that he should, but before Harding had the chance, he died of a heart attack in San Francisco on August 2nd. Warren G. Harding served as President of the United States from 1921 until his death in 1923. The corruption within his administration has since become his legacy. Calvin Coolidge was about to take the reins, and Silent Cal made it his mission to restore prestige to the presidency. Let's look now to Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge. Prior to becoming the 30th president, Coolidge was born on the 4th of July in 1872. Years later, he graduated college with honors, was admitted to the Massachusetts State Bar, and began practicing law in the city of Northampton. Coolidge soon became involved in local politics, holding various roles. In 1907, he became a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. In the coming years, Coolidge's career saw rapid upward mobility, from the state senate to the lieutenant governor's office, and eventually reaching the governorship of Massachusetts in 1919. That September, Boston police walked off the job and riots broke out across the city. Governor Coolidge sent in the Massachusetts National Guard to restore order. Coolidge wrote to the leader of the strike saying, quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anyone, anywhere, anytime." The strike ended shortly thereafter, and Coolidge became a symbol of law and order. In 1920, at the Republican National Convention, Governor Coolidge was selected as the vice presidential candidate, running alongside Senator Warren Harding of Ohio. Harding and Coolidge won the election by significant margins. As vice president, Coolidge mostly attended Senate proceedings and social gatherings in Washington, D.C., but he was the first VP to be invited to sit in on presidential cabinet meetings. On the morning of August 3, 1923, while vacationing at his father's home in Vermont, Vice President Coolidge was awoken by his father to the news of President Harding's death the previous night. Coolidge was sworn in before 3 a.m. that morning by the light of kerosene lamp. The oath was administered by his father, a notary, using his family Bible. Coolidge was now the 30th President of the United States. Now the chief executive, Coolidge took a policy of cutting taxes and federal non-interference when it came to the economy. He refused to check the economic growth, contributing to an era of prosperity. In 1924, Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted citizenship status to all Native Americans born in the United States. His popularity soon soared. In campaigning with the phrase, "Keep it cool with Coolidge," he was easily elected in his own right. In his second term, Coolidge sought to maintain the era of prosperity he ushered in his first. His strategy for achieving this? Minimal government intervention. And it worked. In 1927, Coolidge dedicated Mount Rushmore National Memorial in the Black Hills of South Dakota. While he was there, he announced he would not run for re-election in 1928. With Coolidge not in the running, the Republican Party nominated Herbert Hoover, who won the election that November. Calvin Coolidge served as President of the United States from 1923 to 1929. Upon exiting the presidency, Coolidge left Hoover with a prospering economy, which took a drastic turn for the worse later that year, bringing America into the Great Depression that would last for more than a decade. Next up is the great humanitarian, Herbert Hoover. Prior to becoming the 31st president, Hoover enrolled at Stanford University at the age of 17 and went on to graduate as a mining engineer. In 1899, Hoover and his wife moved to China, where he was hired to be a mining consultant for the Chinese government. While they lived there, the Boxer Rebellion erupted, and the Hoovers were trapped in Tinson for nearly a month as their settlement was under heavy fire. During this time, Hoover directed the building of barracks and once risked his life saving Chinese children. At the outbreak of World War I, Hoover aided the cause of getting stranded American tourists out of the war zone. Within weeks, he and his committee got 120,000 Americans back home. He then turned his humanitarian efforts to organizing the Commission of Relief, through which he provided food to millions of people in war-torn Belgium and northern France. Upon U.S. entry into the war, President Wilson appointed Hoover as U.S. Food Administrator in charge of coordinating production and conservation of food supplies. Just one day after Allied and Central Powers reached an armistice agreement ending the hostilities of the war, Hoover founded the American Relief Administration, which went on to provide $363 million in aid to post-war recovery efforts across 21 European nations. He also began the European Children's Fund, which helped to feed over 12 million children in its first 5 years. At the start of the Harding administration, Hoover was appointed the Secretary of Commerce and served in that role into the Coolidge years. He did this all while maintaining his various humanitarian efforts, including the feeding of 10 million Russians per day for a period in 1922. Hoover turned his efforts stateside after the Mississippi River flooded 25,000 square miles and killed over 300 people in the spring of 1927. To provide the necessary aid, Hoover collaborated with 8 government agencies, the Red Cross, as well as 91 local communities. After President Coolidge announced his intentions to not seek re-election in 1928, the great humanitarian was the obvious choice for the Republican nomination. His incredible popularity carried him to the White House that November. Herbert Hoover was now set to become the 31st President of the United States. Prosperity seemed to be on the horizon in America. Unfortunately, this feeling would not last. The Wall Street stock market crashed in October of 1929, causing businesses to fail and unemployment to rapidly rise. The nation was on an unbridled path toward depression. In an effort to relieve the American people of the effects, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. The act sought to raise tariffs to the highest levels in history and raise more money for the federal government. President Hoover did not feel this was the right strategy, but made the critical error of signing the tariff against his better judgment. America's trading partners responded by raising their own tariffs. This stalled international trade, exacerbating the problem. The nation was in economic freefall. President Hoover tried many strategies to pull America out of this, but to no avail. Around 25% of all Americans became unemployed. Many lost their homes. In urban areas, the poor took to living in a community of shacks, commonly known as Hoovervilles. The Great Depression had now swallowed the United States and soon the world at large. By 1932, Hoover was blamed for the Depression and lost re-election by historic margins to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal for all Americans. Herbert Hoover served as President of the United States from 1929 to 1933. We now arrive at FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Before becoming the 32nd president, FDR was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by an incoming President Wilson in 1913. At the outbreak of the First World War, Roosevelt voiced his disapproval of President Wilson's stance on American neutrality. When the U.S. did enter the war in 1917, FDR sought deployment, but President Wilson directly intervened, saying he was needed stateside to organize the Navy's expansion and deployment. After the war, Roosevelt rose to the national political spotlight with his nomination for the vice presidency on the Democratic ticket in 1920, alongside James M. Cox. They were defeated that November. Following this political loss came a personal one. In 1921, FDR contracted polio, partially paralyzing him from the waist down. In the coming years, Roosevelt continually fought to regain the use of his legs. FDR's political career relaunched with his election as New York's governor in 1928. In this role, he took on the greatest crisis of his career thus far, the Great Depression. His actions there increased his national profile and helped secure him the nomination on the Democratic ticket for president in 1932. He earnestly campaigned on a platform advocating for government intervention to provide economic relief, recovery, and reform, calling it the New Deal. FDR defeated President Herbert Hoover in a landslide that November. Franklin Delano Roosevelt went on to become the 32nd President of the United States. By the time Roosevelt took office, more than 13 million people were unemployed, and nearly every bank in the country was closed. He quickly pushed Congress to sit for 100 days, where they worked to pass foundational New Deal measures like the Economy Act and the Banking Act, the latter of which established FDIC and remains an underpinning of the modern banking system. Over the next couple of years, Roosevelt continued to sign into law a series of social programs in an effort to support the American people. He repeatedly made radio addresses to appeal directly to the American people to support his policies. These became known as his fireside chats. By 1935, the nation had begun to recover, but FDR's New Deal was facing backlash. Roosevelt doubled down. He pushed for a lot of the programs that we know today, most famously the Social Security program. In 1936, FDR was up for re-election and won with over 98% of the Electoral College, the largest landslide in U.S. history. In his second term, Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which standardized the minimum wage and a maximum number of working hours. The following year, the Second World War began in Europe. FDR's concern began to shift more toward foreign affairs. Roosevelt, like Wilson before him, declared America's neutrality. But the Axis powers of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy continued their aggression across the European continent. By 1940, France had fallen, and Britain was under siege by the Nazis. This pushed Roosevelt to begin to provide military aid to Great Britain. That same year, FDR was elected to an unprecedented third term. On December 7, 1941, the nation was forever changed when Japanese bombers surprisingly attacked Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,000 Americans. The day after, Roosevelt demanded Congress declare war on Japan. They did so before the day was done. In response, Germany and Italy soon declared war on the United States. America was at war. The commander-in-chief then oversaw the nation as it mobilized its forces. President Roosevelt relentlessly pushed for Allied advancement, resulting in the victorious campaigns of North Africa in 1942, Sicily and Italy in 1943, and the successful D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy, France in 1944. That same year, Roosevelt ran for a fourth term as president, this time alongside his new running mate, Harry S. Truman of Missouri. FDR was re-elected in yet another landslide election. In early 1945, President Roosevelt traveled to attend the Yalta Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to begin post-war discussions. Victory in Europe soon became certain, but the war had taken its toll on the health of the commander-in-chief. President Roosevelt was still recovering from his 14,000-mile trip to Yalta when, on April 12th, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served as President of the United States from 1933 until his death in 1945. The responsibility of finishing the war now fell to the man from Independence. Proceeding now to the man from Independence, Harry S. Truman. Prior to becoming the 33rd president, Truman was a farmer in Missouri. Truman left the farm to enlist in the Army upon U.S. entry into World War I in 1917. Truman served in France as a captain in the field artillery. Over the course of the war, not one soldier under his command was killed in combat. By the end of the war, Truman was promoted to major. Starting in 1922, Truman began his political career with his election to a county judge seat. But it was Truman's election to the U.S. Senate in 1934 that really launched him to national status. While senator, Truman was head of the War Investigation Committee, which looked into possible waste and corruption. His committee saved millions of dollars, with some estimates reaching as much as $15 billion during World War II. In 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt was nominated for a fourth term by the Democrats. Truman was chosen as the vice presidential nominee. The pair won that November. President Roosevelt's health was failing even before his inauguration in January of 1945. On April 12th, President Roosevelt suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. 2 hours later, Truman became the 33rd President of the United States. By the time he assumed the high office, the war in Europe was nearly won. The war in the Pacific, however, dragged on. President Truman, after being briefed on the Manhattan Project and the newly developed atomic bomb, issued a demand calling for the unconditional surrender of Japan, warning them of destruction if they refused. No reply was given. So, on August 6th, the bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. The city was leveled, and within minutes, 80,000 people were dead. 3 days later, after there was still no surrender, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki. 39,000 were instantly killed, and another city was flattened. This remains the most controversial moment of Truman's time in office. Japan surrendered shortly afterward, and the Second World War was finally over. In 1947, the Soviet Union began to threaten the countries of Turkey and Greece. In response, the president issued the Truman Doctrine, pledging political, military, and economic support to all democratic nations under the threat of authoritarianism. This is commonly seen as the start of the Cold War. In 1948, Truman ran for election in his own right, winning the Democratic nomination and later defeating Republican Thomas Dewey of New York with 57% of the Electoral College. In his second term, Truman negotiated the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1950, the North Korean Communist government invaded democratic South Korea. Staying true to the doctrine that bears his name, Truman took military action to aid them, thus beginning the Korean War. During the war, President Truman kept the conflict contained to avoid the possibility of a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. The war persisted for years, lasting the remainder of Truman's time in office. War hero Dwight David Eisenhower succeeded him to the presidency to see it through. Harry S. Truman served as President of the United States from 1945 to 1953. Looking now to Ike, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Prior to becoming the 34th president, Ike attended the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, New York, where he graduated in 1915. His early military career consisted of him being stationed at various army camps across the nation. During this time, he served under notable generals including John Pershing and Douglas MacArthur. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the Second World War, Ike was called into action. He commanded the Allied forces during the landing of North Africa in 1942. Afterward, Eisenhower quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces and a 5-star general of the Army. He received the latter rank after he was placed in charge of Operation Overlord, where he organized the successful D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy, France in 1944, turning the tide of the war in Europe in favor of the Allies. By the end of the war, General Eisenhower was a hero known round the world. Years later, after a respite from military service, General Eisenhower was named as the first Supreme Commander of NATO. In this role, he sought to maintain peace at the dawn of the Cold War. While serving this post, members of the Republican Party convinced him to run for president. Campaigning on the iconic slogan, "I like Ike," and on a platform of ending the Korean War, Eisenhower dominated in the 1952 election with 83% of the Electoral College. Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. The new Commander-in-Chief soon made good on his campaign promise to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. Just months into his term, an armistice was signed, ending the war. By the mid-1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed the hydrogen bomb. The threat of destruction loomed large. President Eisenhower took action and called the Geneva Summit in 1955, where he hoped to negotiate disarmament. Although no agreements were made, the conference succeeded in easing tensions. In 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. This created the interstate highway system that's now used by millions of Americans every day. Ike ran for the White House again in a rematch election that same year and won in an even larger landslide than 4 years before. In 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA. The next year, Ike became the last president to sign statehood bills with the admittance of Alaska and Hawaii as the 49th and 50th states. Above all, President Eisenhower, despite his decades of military service, wanted to be remembered for peace, even calling for a prayer for peace to close his farewell address. Dwight D. Eisenhower served as President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. The time had come for another generation of leadership to lead the nation into a new frontier. We've now reached JFK, John F. Kennedy. Prior to becoming the 35th president, JFK attended Harvard and graduated in 1940. He then enlisted in the Navy, and the United States entered World War II in December of 1941. After completion of naval training, a young Ensign Kennedy was whisked to the Pacific. On August 1, 1943, Kennedy was on board the PT-109 when it was split in two and sunk after it was rammed into by a Japanese destroyer. Kennedy was thrown from the deck and sustained injuries to his back. Despite this, he led the survivors, including carrying another injured crew member through the water on a 5-hour swim to a nearby island, where he and the survivors were rescued 1 week later. Following the war, Kennedy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1946 and was re-elected in 1948. While in this role, Kennedy vied for a seat in the U.S. Senate, campaigning across Massachusetts. In 1952, his years of campaigning paid off with his election victory over the incumbent Republican senator. A Navy war hero and a senator, Kennedy was seen as a prominent candidate for the vice presidency in 1956, but he lost the nomination. Despite this defeat, Kennedy's popularity soared, and in 1960 he was nominated by the Democrats on the first ballot, beating out Lyndon Johnson, who he tapped as his running mate. Kennedy faced off with Vice President Richard Nixon of California in the general election. The two participated in the first televised presidential debate on September 26 that year. Kennedy campaigned on a platform of domestic, social, and economic reform, promising a new frontier. Kennedy won the election over Vice President Nixon by just 118,000 votes, becoming the youngest president ever to be elected. In January 1961, Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, he made his famous appeal to the virtue of American citizens.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
As president, Kennedy sought expansive economic growth, making good on his pledge to get America moving again. Just months into his term, President Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress where he pushed the space race.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Kennedy also sought to provide economic and social aid to developing Latin American nations through the Alliance for Progress and the Peace Corps programs. However, not all the nations were friendly with the U.S., namely Communist Cuba. Later that year, JFK gave the go-ahead for a CIA plan to invade Cuba. However, the invasion was a failure and negatively influenced relations with the neighboring island nation as well as with the Soviets. These tensions led to the raising of the Berlin Wall, separating the U.S.-influenced western part from the Soviet-controlled east. These tensions came to a head in October of 1962 when U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviets' pursuit of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a nearly 2-week stalemate where the threat of a direct conflict with the Soviets and a nuclear war was the highest it has ever been. Kennedy pushed for a show of strength and restraint. The crisis ended when the Soviets backed down and the tensions began to cool once again. Kennedy's handling of the crisis bolstered his reputation at home and abroad. President Kennedy also took action toward the cause of equal rights, calling for new civil rights legislation, eventually culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. JFK, eyeing for re-election, sought to drum up support for his new frontier policies. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy traveled to Dallas, Texas as part of a 2-day tour of the state. Kennedy was riding in a motorcade with his wife Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, and his wife when 3 shots rang out. The second and third bullets hit the president. The third shot proved fatal. Barely past his 1,000th day in office, President Kennedy was slain by an assassin's bullet. John F. Kennedy served as President of the United States from 1961 until his death in 1963. It was now up to incoming President Johnson to lead the heartbroken nation. Turning now to LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Prior to becoming the 36th president, Johnson taught at an elementary school in Texas. LBJ was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1937, campaigning on his support of FDR's New Deal. LBJ left Congress in 1940 to enter the Navy. Upon American entry into World War II, Lieutenant Commander Johnson reported for duty. After receiving naval operations training, Johnson began inspection duty in the Pacific, where he was an observer of bomber missions. His service in the war was cut short when President Roosevelt ordered all members of Congress and the armed forces to return. Following his continued service in the U.S. House of Representatives, Johnson was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948. In 1954, Johnson became the majority leader and began a cooperative relationship with President Eisenhower. In 1960, Senator Johnson ran for the Democratic nomination for president. He lost to fellow Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. However, Kennedy tapped Johnson to be his running mate. The pair went on to win that November. Johnson served as vice president until the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Johnson, aboard Air Force One, was then sworn in as the 36th president of the United States. Afterward, the new chief executive made his first remarks.
I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
President Johnson then got to work. He prioritized legislation that President Kennedy had been pushing for at the time of his death. One prominent example was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed public discrimination and segregation. That year, LBJ ran for the high office in his own right. He ran against Republican Barry Goldwater of Arizona and won in a landslide. As president, Johnson began to push for what he called the Great Society. With the backing of Congress, Johnson's Great Society resulted in the passing of prominent programs, including Medicare, in 1965. Two crises came to define President Johnson's second term in office, one domestic and one overseas. The domestic crisis was that of extreme civil unrest in urban areas across the U.S., which eventually led to the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The foreign crisis was that of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, where American forces were trying to fend off the aggression of communist North Vietnam. President Johnson repeatedly attempted negotiations to end the war, but those were unsuccessful. In March of 1968, President Johnson surprised the nation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
This and the assassination of prominent Democratic candidate Robert F. Kennedy led to chaos at the Democratic Convention and the eventual election of Republican Richard Nixon that November. Lyndon B. Johnson served as President of the United States from 1963 to 1969. Next is Tricky Dick, Richard Milhous Nixon. Prior to becoming the 37th president, Nixon attended Duke Law School, where he graduated in 1937. In 1942, Nixon joined the U.S. Naval Reserve, and a year after that, Nixon volunteered for sea duty, becoming a lieutenant commander serving in the Pacific. At the end of the war, Nixon was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Years later, Nixon was elected as a U.S. Senator, where he criticized President Truman's handling of the Korean War and warned of a growing communist threat. This caught the eye of General Dwight Eisenhower, who chose Nixon as his running mate on the Republican ticket in 1952. They won that November. After serving with distinction as vice president for 8 years, Nixon ran for the high office for himself, winning the Republican nomination. He went on to face Democrat John F. Kennedy in the general election. The pair engaged in a series of televised debates. Nixon lost the election to Kennedy by just 118,000 votes. This defeat was followed by another in 1962 when he lost his gubernatorial bid in California, leaving Nixon to remark that his political career was over. After a respite from politics, Nixon began speaking publicly about U.S. foreign policy, most notably America's involvement in Vietnam. This won him the support of the Republican Party once more. In 1968, he made a bid for the high office once again. With a chaotic showing from the Democrats, Nixon won the election that November. He then became the 37th President of the United States. Now the chief executive, Nixon sought to end the Vietnam War and called on the silent majority of Americans to support his policy of a negotiated peace and Vietnamization, which transferred the burden of war on South Vietnam as the U.S. gradually withdrew, which they eventually did by 1973. In 1972, President Nixon made two prominent visits overseas in an effort to relieve Cold War tensions. He first visited China and met with communist leaders, ushering in an era of cooperation between the nations. Months later, he traveled to Moscow and met with Soviet leadership, where they negotiated the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, formalizing nuclear weapons limitation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That same year, Nixon ran for re-election. While he won that November, a break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate Hotel in June was the beginning of the end for the Nixon presidency. Continued controversy mired Nixon's second term. In 1973, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned from his office due to his own scandals, leading to the appointment of Michigan Representative Gerald Ford in accordance with the 25th Amendment. By 1974, President Nixon had become implicated in the cover-up of the Watergate scandal, and impeachment seemed inevitable. So, on August 8th, President Nixon announced his resignation from office.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Richard Nixon served as President of the United States from 1969 until his resignation from office in 1974. It was now up to the newly sworn-in President Ford to lead the nation through this tumultuous time. Proceeding to Jerry, Gerald R. Ford. Before becoming the 38th president, Ford served in the Navy during World War II at the rank of lieutenant commander, where he barely survived a typhoon in the Philippine Sea in 1944, which killed nearly 800 of his crewmates. After the war, Ford was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Michigan's 5th District in 1948. He served in that role for the subsequent 25 years, until 1973, when he was selected by President Nixon to become the vice president. The following year, Nixon himself resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. Ford, without having been elected to national office, then became the 38th President of the United States. Less than a month into his term, President Ford took executive action to finally put the Watergate scandal to rest, granting a full, free, and absolute pardon to former President Richard Nixon. Moving forward, President Ford looked to handle domestic issues like inflation and the national deficit. In foreign policy, after the fall of both Cambodia and South Vietnam to the communists, Ford sought to regain American influence abroad. His biggest accomplishment there was helping negotiate a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. In the year of the bicentennial, President Ford narrowly beat former California Governor Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination. That November, Ford was defeated by Democrat Jimmy Carter. Gerald R. Ford served as President of the United States from 1974 to 1977. Let's look next at the peanut farmer, Jimmy Carter. Before becoming the 39th president, Carter was raised on a peanut farm in Georgia. Beginning in 1946, Carter served in the Navy as a submariner at the dawn of the Cold War. After 7 years, Carter was discharged from service and returned to run his family farm. In 1962, Carter began his political career with his election to the state Senate. He then ran for governor and won in 1970. 4 years later, Carter announced he was running for president. After a 2-year campaign, Carter won the Democratic nomination for president in 1976 and narrowly won the general election that November, beating President Ford. Carter went on to become the 39th president of the United States. President Carter sought to get a handle on domestic issues such as unemployment. His efforts inadvertently led to a recession with a rapid rise in inflation and interest rates. During his tenure, an increase in oil prices overseas led to an energy crisis and a massive cost of living adjustment, exacerbating economic problems such as inflation, which hit double digits. In foreign policy, President Carter brokered the Camp David Accords, which established peaceful terms between Egypt and Israel. This is often regarded as his greatest accomplishment in foreign policy. In 1979, Carter also helped negotiate SALT II with the Soviet Union, placing further nuclear arms limitations on both parties. That same year, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took more than 50 Americans hostage. President Carter quickly took action, attempting negotiations for their release. None worked, so Carter authorized a rescue operation, which was aborted partway through and led to the deaths of 8 service members. President Carter assumed full responsibility. As the Iranian hostage crisis dragged on, Carter faced Republican challenger Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. The ongoing economic issues domestically and the crisis overseas contributed to Reagan's decisive victory over President Carter. Jimmy Carter served as President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. We now arrive at the great communicator, Ronald Reagan. Prior to becoming the 40th president, Reagan was an actor in Hollywood. In the 1940s, in addition to starring in his many films, Reagan was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild. He focused on uprooting communist influences in the unions, even working with the FBI as an informant with the codename T-10. In his struggle with communism in the film industry, Reagan found himself identifying closer with conservatism than the liberalism he previously held dear. He became a rising voice for conservatism, campaigning for Barry Goldwater in 1964. 2 years later, Reagan ran for governor of California, winning by more than 1 million votes. In this role, he turned the government deficit into a surplus, and he was re-elected in 1970. Upon completion of his gubernatorial terms, Reagan ran for president in 1976. He lost the Republican nomination to President Ford by little more than 100 votes. In 1980, Reagan ran for president once more. He won the Republican nomination and tapped former Texas Congressman George Bush as his running mate. By 1980, the widespread stagflation weakened President Carter in the polls, and Reagan seized the opportunity to appeal directly to the American people.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? If you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
This appeal, the poor state of the economy, and the ongoing Iranian hostage crisis all contributed to the great communicator's landslide victory over President Carter. Ronald Reagan was now to become the 40th president of the United States. And the same day of his inauguration, all the Americans who were held hostage in Iran were released. Just 69 days into his term in office, after giving a speech at the Washington Hilton Hotel, President Reagan was approaching his limousine when John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots at the president, one of which struck him in the left of his chest. The president was quickly thrown into the limousine and was taken to the hospital once he had started coughing up blood. After doctors removed the bullet, Reagan spent 12 days in the hospital before returning to the White House with a renewed vigor for the job he had left to do. His popularity skyrocketed. President Reagan, with aid from Congress, then successfully restored the American economy by controlling inflation, enhancing job opportunities, and fostering economic growth. He also set forth a strategy for reducing taxes, government spending, and regulations. These policies became commonly known as Reaganomics. He stood firm on his policies even as the expanding defense budget resulted in a significant deficit. His push to increase defense spending came as dealings with the Soviet Union worsened. The great communicator knew he needed to face the issue directly if he was going to improve relations. But first, he faced the American voters. President Reagan ran for a second term in 1984 against former Vice President Walter Mondale of Minnesota. Reagan won 49 of the 50 states in the second most lopsided presidential election in U.S. history. The following year, Reagan attended the Geneva summit with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. While no formal agreements were made, the summit was successful and led to the thawing of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This eventually culminated in the INF Treaty in 1987, which eliminated certain nuclear weapons. This was seen as a pivotal moment for the Cold War. That same year, President Reagan traveled to West Berlin, where he made an impassioned plea for the cause of peace and reunification.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
This speech marked a turning point that eventually led to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Cold War in 1991. As Reagan left office, his popularity soared, helping the election of his Vice President George Bush to succeed him as chief executive. Ronald Reagan served as President of the United States from 1981 to 1989. Now to Timberwolf, George Herbert Walker Bush. Before becoming the 41st president, Bush enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday. He went through flight training and became the youngest naval aviator up to that point. While on a bomber mission in the Pacific, Bush's aircraft was shot down. Bush, the only survivor from the plane, waited for hours until he was rescued from the water by a submarine. Once the war was over, Bush entered the oil industry in Texas. Following his success there, he ran for the U.S. House of Representatives, winning the first of 2 terms in 1966. In 1971, President Richard Nixon appointed Bush as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. In the coming years, Bush held a number of prominent roles, including chairman of the RNC, chief U.S. liaison officer to Communist China, and director of the CIA. Bush ran for president in 1980. He lost the nomination to Ronald Reagan, but was tapped to be his running mate. The two decisively won that November. In 1981, after the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, Bush took on some of the president's schedule as he recovered from surgery. In 1988, Vice President Bush won the Republican nomination for president in the general election that November. He then became the 41st President of the United States. As President Bush came into office, the Cold War was winding down. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the communists were being overthrown in Eastern Europe. That same year, Bush sent American forces into Panama to depose of the corrupt government of General Manuel Noriega, who was wanted by the U.S. for drug trafficking. After just over a month of Operation Just Cause, Noriega was captured and brought to the United States. In 1990, the president worked with Soviet leaders to successfully push for German reunification. Domestically, Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act of 1990, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991. President Bush's attention turned once again to foreign affairs when Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. President Bush, with support from the United Nations and Congress, sent in nearly 500,000 American troops, inciting the Gulf War in 1991. The war lasted a couple of weeks and ended with Iraq being driven out of Kuwait. This overwhelming victory led to a rise in Bush's popularity. Also in 1991, President Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, which reduced nuclear stockpiles in both countries by 1/3. The official dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred later that year. The Cold War was finally won. Bush ran for re-election in 1992, but with the slowing economy, he lost to Democrat Bill Clinton. George H.W. Bush served as President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. Next up is the comeback kid, Bill Clinton. Prior to becoming the 42nd president, Clinton taught law at the University of Arkansas. He successfully entered politics in 1976 with his election as Arkansas Attorney General and was elected governor 2 years later. He was defeated running for re-election, but won the office again the following cycle. In 1991, Clinton resigned as governor so that he could run for president. He won the Democratic nomination in 1992 and faced President George H.W. Bush and third-party candidate Ross Perot in the general election. Clinton secured the win that November and went on to become the 42nd President of the United States. In his first year as chief executive, Clinton signed the Brady Act, which instituted background checks before purchasing a handgun, and he signed the ratification of NAFTA. During his tenure, Clinton oversaw low unemployment, low inflation, and high home ownership, leading him to easily win re-election in 1996. 2 years later, President Clinton's popularity took a hit with the emergence of a scandal. It was alleged that he had an extramarital affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky and was further accused of asking her to deny the affair to authorities, allegations Clinton vehemently denied.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false.
He repeatedly denied the claims, including once under oath. However, after more evidence emerged confirming the affair, President Clinton admitted to lying under oath. He was subsequently impeached by the House and was acquitted by the Senate early the following year. President Clinton later apologized to the nation for his actions. As Clinton neared the end of his time in office, his vice president, Al Gore, ran to succeed him in the high office, but was defeated by Texas Governor George W. Bush. Bill Clinton served as President of the United States from 1993 to 2001. Looking now to the second president, who was the son of a president, George W. Bush. Prior to becoming the 43rd president, Bush was a fighter pilot in the Texas Air National Guard. In 1988, Bush worked on his father's presidential campaign, after which he pursued his own course in politics. In 1994, Bush was elected governor of Texas and was re-elected 4 years later. Bush, taking a page out of his father's book, ran for the high office in 2000. He went up against Vice President Al Gore in what turned out to be one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Bush was now to become the 43rd president of the United States. Just months into his term, on Tuesday, September 11, 2001, America suffered the most horrific attack on the homeland in the nation's history. Nearly 3,000 people were killed as a result of the coordinated terror attacks, with over 6,000 more injured. President Bush visited Ground Zero in New York City just 3 days after the attacks, as smoke still rose from the site.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
U.S. soldiers were soon on the ground in Afghanistan to hunt down Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. Before the year was out, the global war on terror was in full effect. At home, security institutions, including the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA, were created. Concerning domestic issues, President Bush delivered major tax cuts and signed the No Child Left Behind Act. In 2003, the war on terror expanded when the U.S. invaded Iraq based on the belief that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein posed a threat to the country. Hussein was eventually captured, but stability in Iraq was disrupted. This remains President Bush's most controversial act. He won re-election in 2004, and in his second term, he continued much of the policies of his first. In the mid to late 2000s, housing costs were on an unsteady and rapid rise, which eventually led to the market crash of 2008 and caused many homeowners to lose their homes. But the handling of the economic downturn and the ongoing war on terror would fall on Bush's successor, Barack Obama. George W. Bush served as President of the United States from 2001 to 2009. Turning now to Barack Obama. Before becoming the 44th president, Obama began his political career with his election to the Illinois State Senate in 1996. He ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 2000, but lost to the incumbent. Obama was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2004. That same year, he delivered the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention, leading some political experts to say he had the makings of a future president. And in 3 years' time, Obama took the leap and announced his candidacy for president. Obama secured the Democratic nomination and won the general election that November, beating Arizona Senator John McCain. Barack Obama then became the 44th President of the United States. In his first month in office, President Obama signed a Fair Pay Act for women and a bill to stimulate the economy as it was struggling through the Great Recession. In 2010, Obama signed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which proved to be one of the largest reforms to the healthcare system in the last half-century. The act has also become known as Obamacare. In foreign policy, the war on terror continued in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2011, Obama oversaw the Navy SEAL mission that resulted in the death of 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden, a significant milestone for the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East. In 2012, Obama won re-election over Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, although with a smaller margin of victory than he did 4 years prior. In his second term, Obama pushed to repair relations with Cuba and expand trade partnerships in the Pacific. Obama also sought to negotiate a deal with Iran to limit their development of nuclear technology, specifically preventing the acquisition of nuclear weapons. In his final year in office, he signed the Paris Agreement, which took aim at lowering greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change. As Obama made ready to exit the presidency, he met with President-elect Donald Trump to ensure a smooth transition of power. Barack Obama served as President of the United States from 2009 to 2017. We now have reached the Donald J. Trump. Before becoming the 45th president, Trump was a real estate developer in New York City. While he ran the Trump Organization, the business's developments included hotels, resorts, and even golf courses. Trump released the first of his many books, The Art of the Deal, in 1987. In 2004, Trump launched his reality TV show, The Apprentice, which he hosted until 2015. After years of celebrity, billionaire Donald Trump entered the political arena with his announcement in 2015 that he was running for president. Trump ran for the Republican nomination in a crowded contest, but he defeated 17 other contenders during the primary process, campaigning on the now famous slogan, "Make America Great Again." Trump faced off in the general election against former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in a heated campaign. While Clinton won the national popular vote, Trump won the election through his victory in the Electoral College. Donald J. Trump went on to become the 45th President of the United States and the first to ever be elected without previously holding political office or serving in the military. In 2017, President Trump successfully pushed for significant tax cuts and federal deregulation. Additionally, President Trump aggressively pushed for the enforcement of border and immigration policies, eventually following through on his campaign promise to construct a wall along the border with Mexico. In 2018, Trump's administration facilitated the move of the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and aided in negotiations between Israel and other countries. That same year, Trump attended a summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. This marked the first time a sitting U.S. president met with a North Korean leader. He formally entered the communist nation a year later. In 2019, President Trump was impeached by the U.S. House of Representatives after a whistleblower claimed he tried to pressure the president of Ukraine to investigate Hunter Biden, the son of former Vice President Joe Biden. Trump was acquitted by the Senate on all counts. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States and dominated the remainder of Trump's time in office. Amid the pandemic, he ran for re-election and faced Joe Biden. When the race was called with Biden as the winner, Trump claimed widespread voter fraud had affected the outcome. On January 6, 2021, President Trump held a rally outside the White House calling for supporters to protest the election certification of Biden as the winner. The Capitol was breached and violence ensued. Afterward, the House impeached Trump for a second time shortly before he left office. He was acquitted on all counts by the Senate a month later. Donald J. Trump served as President of the United States from 2017 to 2021. Time now for Joe Biden. Before becoming the 46th president, Biden was one of the youngest senators ever elected at the age of 29 in 1972. He served in the Senate for 36 years. While he was a senator, Biden ran for president twice, once in 1988 and another time in 2008, losing both times. However, in 2008, Biden was tapped to be the running mate of Democratic nominee Barack Obama. The two went on to win the election that November. Joe Biden served as Vice President of the United States for 8 years, leaving office in 2017. Biden announced he was running for president 2 years later. In 2020, the United States was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which remained a prominent issue throughout the campaign. After winning the Democratic nomination, Biden faced President Trump in the general election that November. The race was called with Biden as the winner, but Trump claimed widespread voter fraud had affected the outcome. On January 6, 2021, a joint session of Congress convened to certify the 2020 election, but the count was disrupted when violence erupted at the Capitol. Congress certified Biden as the winner the following morning. Joe Biden went on to become the 46th President of the United States. Shortly after taking office, Biden ordered the withdrawal from Afghanistan, seeking to bring a formal end to the nearly 20-year conflict. While U.S. troops pulled out, the Taliban regained power in Afghanistan. As the final stages of the withdrawal unfolded, the Kabul airport was attacked by a suicide bomber, resulting in the death of 13 American service members and over 150 Afghan civilians. The evacuation continued, and America's longest war was soon over. President Biden also made handling the ongoing pandemic a top priority. In 2021, he issued controversial federal mandates that required millions of Americans to receive the newly developed COVID-19 vaccine or submit to weekly testing. In his domestic policies, President Biden signed 2 bills prioritizing infrastructure spending, lowering energy costs, and investing in clean energy to combat climate change. In 2022, the Russo-Ukrainian War began. President Biden pushed Congress to send aid to Ukraine to provide military assistance. As of October 2024, the U.S. has sent over $64 billion in aid. Following the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war in October 2023, the United States, with Biden's support, has sent over $17.9 billion of military aid by the war's first anniversary. President Biden ran for re-election in 2024 and won the necessary number of delegates in the primary process to secure the Democratic nomination for president. With former President Trump having done the same on the Republican side, a rematch election was all but certain. In June of 2024, President Biden and Trump faced off in a debate. Following what has been seen as a poor performance, Biden faced mounting pressure from leaders within his own party to drop out of the race. After nearly a month of this, Biden acquiesced to the will of his party and formally announced his withdrawal from the 2024 race and his endorsement of Vice President Harris for the nomination on the Democratic ticket for president. Joe Biden has served as President of the United States from 2021 to the present day. His term in office will finish January 20th, 2025. We now arrive at the once and future President, Donald J. Trump. Just before leaving office in 2021, Trump departed Washington, D.C. to return to his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, and the outgoing president teased a future political run. In his post-presidency, Trump paid close attention to the policies of his successor, providing sharp criticism. In August of 2022, the FBI raided Trump's home of Mar-a-Lago. Armed agents entered the complex to seize documents the former president allegedly brought with him as he left office. This later became the basis for the classified documents case against him. Following the midterm elections of 2022, former President Trump announced that he'd seek the presidency once again. After this announcement, in 2023, Trump was criminally charged in 4 cases. First, he was accused of falsifying business records in the state of New York. He pled not guilty to all 34 charges, but following a month-long trial, a Manhattan jury reached a guilty verdict on each count. It is currently in the appeals process. The second was the classified documents case, which was dismissed in U.S. District Court in Florida. In the third case against him, Trump was charged for claiming fraud had affected the outcome of the 2020 election and was further accused of wrongdoing in relation to the events of January 6, 2021. In 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that a president, while in office, has immunity for any official act. This halted the progression of this case. The fourth was the state case in Georgia, in which Trump and 18 co-defendants allegedly attempted to interfere in the state's 2020 election results certification. This case led to his booking in Fulton County Jail and that now famous mugshot. The case's progression was indefinitely postponed when a conflict of interest related to the prosecuting attorney was revealed. In every case against him, Donald Trump has denied any wrongdoing. These cases were used as the basis for the push to remove Trump's name from the primary ballots in multiple states. However, in March 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that Trump could remain on all ballots. Trump fended off a dozen challengers and won enough delegates to secure the Republican nomination in the primary process. When President Biden did the same for the Democrats, a rematch election seemed inevitable. The two debated in June, after which President Biden faced growing pressure from his own party to drop out of the race. As President Biden's campaign was in turmoil, Trump kept campaigning. On July 13th, Trump began speaking at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, when an attempted assassin opened fire. Trump was struck in the ear. Upon being hit, he dropped to avoid further injury. 3 more people were shot, one of whom was killed. In an exchange of fire with the Secret Service, the attempted assassin was also killed. The former president was rushed out of the area and taken for treatment. The attempted assassination galvanized support for him as he headed into the Republican National Convention, where Trump was officially nominated for a 3rd time. Shortly after the convention, President Biden announced that he was exiting the 2024 race and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris for his party's nomination. Now facing a new opponent, Trump and Harris debated in September. Later that month, Trump was the target of a second apparent assassination attempt at his golf course in Florida. The Secret Service confronted the alleged attempted assassin, and following a manhunt, the suspect was arrested later that day. During the final stages of the campaign, Trump performed multiple memorable stunts. Most notably, in October, Trump worked at a McDonald's in Pennsylvania, where he worked the fryer and the drive-thru. In the days leading up to the election, Trump heavily pushed his supporters to vote early, leading to a record turnout in early voting in some areas of the country. On November 5, 2024, Donald Trump was once again elected President of the United States through his victory in both the Electoral College and the national popular vote. He's now the first president to be elected to a non-consecutive second term since Grover Cleveland in 1892, who was the only other president to ever do so. Beginning his upcoming term on January 20th, 2025, Donald J. Trump will serve as the 47th President of the United States of America. I'm Erick George for Valley News Live, and we have now finished your countdown to 47.